Trump is realizing he's going to enter with a lot more leverage over Putin than he had 8 years ago. Putin is in deep trouble. Russia's economy is in deep trouble. They've lost 800,000 casualties. And after 11 years of war, they still only control about 20% of Ukraine. Uh, on the other hand, President Trump is taking over one of the best economies in the world. I mean, publicly, he criticizes Biden all the time, but the fact is, the American economy is in great shape. We've got 31 allies that have many common interests. And so, and he, of course, he sits politically in the US, he's in a very strong position. So I'm hoping that Trump will say, you know what, I'm going to use this leverage over Putin to accomplish what it is Trump wants to do.
Let's turn to the situation on the front line in Ukraine and also in Kursk. I mean, we haven't talked about it so much this time, but the geopolitics and what happens with Trump coming back, I think, is dominating so much at the moment. But what we have seen in recent days, for instance, is Ukraine reportedly capturing its first North Korean prisoners of war in Kursk. What should we read into that? In particular, Russia's increasing reliance, if indeed you think it is a reliance increasingly, on foreign troops.
So there's no doubt that Russia has a serious manpower problem, which is not something that most people would assume. But they have a manpower problem, which is why they're having to not only empty prisons, but also impress guest foreign workers that came into Russia thinking they were going to be working in some factory, and then they end up in a Russian infantry unit somewhere. And now about 12,000 North Korean soldiers have been put into combat. Uh, from talking to Ukrainian officers, I think that these 12,000 are divided up into 4 different brigades that are employed as just like Russian infantry. So their bodies basically into the meat grinder. I think President Zelensky reported the other day that it looks like about 3,000 of them have been killed or wounded. So already 25% have become casualties, and now you've got a couple that are captured. It'll be interesting to see what we learn from them, but it looks like North Koreans, to avoid being captured, are getting killed by Russians or their fellow soldiers if they're wounded, to avoid becoming captured in many cases. And unsurprisingly, at least one of the two said that he thought he was coming there for training. So I, there's a lot behind the scenes that we just don't know yet about these guys. What conclusions can we draw from this? The Kremlin still is reluctant to draft large numbers of troops out of Moscow and St. Petersburg because they don't want a bunch of funerals in those cities. Most of the casualties are coming from the regions outside of Russia's 2 main metropolitan areas. So that allows the Kremlin to say to operate without worrying about casualties. It'll be a different story if they are forced to have to draft troops from those 2 main cities. So I think the North Koreans are filler. They're more fodder for the meat grinder.
And then talking of Kursk, Ukrainian forces have made further advances over the weekend, having launched new offensives about a week ago in the oblast. What do you read into that, and how much significance do you place on the offensive operations that Ukraine launched at the turn of the year in Kursk?
I think at the when this war is over and we look back on it and are studying different aspects of it, the Ukrainian counteroffensive into Kursk, which started back in August and just started a new phase the other day, as you referenced, is going to be seen as a brilliant stroke by the general staff. They took some risks, but they could see out in the far eastern part of Ukraine and around the Pokrovsk area that the Russians lacked the ability to overrun Ukrainian defenders. There is no potential of a breakthrough that they could then go racing to the Dnipro or something like that because they lack the capability. And so while the Russians are able to pound, and achieve very, you could call them micro gains, if you will, at enormous cost to themselves, there was no risk of a breakthrough. And so the Ukrainians saw an opportunity to change the narrative of the war, to regain the initiative, which is what every commander wants. Get the initiative, make the enemy respond to you instead of always responding to the enemy. And by launching this counteroffensive, 3 things for me stand out. Number one, in in an age of drones where Russia has tens of thousands of drones, Ukraine was able to build up a large enough force and attack across the border into Russia, basically without being detected or disrupted. And now they just did it again. That's an incredible failure by the Russian side, but also showing the growing and improving skill of the Ukrainian side on operational security, and also I think improved use of electronic warfare, jamming. It seems like they've gotten really, really good at that. The second thing, of course, this creates a strategic dilemma for the Kremlin as they might potentially be approaching negotiations. And the idea that I think Zelensky and Lavrov both had put forward a few months ago was that any negotiations basically start with Russia gets to keep where the lines are. That's what they get to keep. That doesn't sound so appealing if you've got Ukraine occupying part of Kursk. And then the third dilemma is the operational level, actually dealing with it. They've had to divert a lot of combat power to try and eliminate the Ukrainian bridgehead inside Kursk. These are badly needed resources that can't be used somewhere else.
Now, here we are a week out from the second inauguration of Donald Trump. As someone who has been very public in their support for Ukraine and your desire for their sovereign borders to be respected and restored, what are you expecting from the second Trump administration?
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure. And in fact, I think President-elect Trump is not entirely sure what his ultimate goal is for Ukraine in this war in Ukraine. A few months ago, I think most of us would have written off Ukraine based on what he said. I mean, he talked about we're going to end it in 24 hours, and he never criticizes Russia or Putin. And so it was, I was not optimistic. But in the last few weeks, I've seen and heard different things that give me a little bit of reason for hope. First of all, Trump is realizing he's going to enter with a lot more leverage over Putin than he had 8 years ago. Putin is in deep trouble. Russia's economy is in deep trouble. They've lost 800,000 casualties. And after 11 years of war, they still only control about 20% of Ukraine. On the other hand, President Trump is taking over one of the best economies in the world. I mean, publicly, he criticizes Biden all the time, but the fact is, the American economy is in great shape. We've got 31 allies that have many common interests. And so, of course, he sits politically in the U.S., he's in a very strong position. So I'm hoping that Trump will say, you know what, I'm going to use this leverage over Putin to accomplish what it is Trump wants to do. There are $2 billion worth of aid that were already approved by the Congress that the Biden administration was unable to deliver or will not get delivered by Inauguration Day next Monday. Trump doesn't have to do a thing. And that's $2 billion worth of aid that's already approved. So that could go. And I think also there will be people who will convince the president-elect that this is about deterring China, which the Republicans have always talked about was a higher priority. Anyway, finally, Mr. Kellogg, General Kellogg, as the envoy, has publicly talked about, for negotiating with Russia, you can't trust Russia. That's a great starting point if you're going to negotiate with Russia, is to publicly acknowledge you cannot trust them. And also, Kellogg has emphasized the importance of Ukraine's sovereignty. And then Mr. Waltz, who is the national security advisor, also seems to be a Russia hawk, if you will. So I'm a little bit more optimistic now than I was a few months ago.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.